Welcome to this recording of Law and the Climate Emergency, an online event hosted by esela, the legal network for social impact.
I'm Ellie Mulholland, the Director of the non-profit Commonwealth Climate and Law Initiative and a Climate Risk Senior Associate at law firm in Trellison. And I've been invited to chair the session today by esela. So thank you very much for the invitation. They are the legal network for social impact, and we're co-hosting with London Climate Action Week and the Chancery Lane Project. Today's event is on law and the climate emergency. So I'm going to spend a moment on the state of play of the climate emergency and the role of lawyers. Then we'll go through some introductions for our esteemed panelists and the agenda for discussion today, and then we'll kick off from the experts. Now, there is overwhelming consensus that human activities such as the burning of fossil fuels, land clearing and agriculture contribute significant volumes of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And according to the IPCC, so that's the gold standard for climate science, the release of these excess greenhouse gas emissions attributable to human activities has already caused approximately 1 degree of global warming above pre-industrial temperatures. Now, this human-induced climate change is already having a profound effect across the world. And I live in London, so I'm coming to you from London Climate Action Week today, but you will hear my Australian accent. And over Christmas, my country burned. Over 11 million Australians had their health and livelihoods affected by smoke, and we lost over 1 billion animals, not including insects, in fires that the scientists tell us were at least 30% more likely to happen because of climate change. And rising temperatures create further risks to health, livelihoods, food security, water supply, and human security. So much so that the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, has described climate change as a direct existential threat. So the kids have been striking now for almost 2 years, telling us what is the point in going to school if we can't see a safe future where we live within planetary ecological boundaries with the necessities for just societies. And climate emergency declarations have been made in over 1,700 jurisdictions, covering 820 million citizens. Architects in the UK, doctors in Australia have all declared climate emergencies. And in May, the global voice of the legal profession, the International Bar Association, launched its climate crisis statement, acknowledging the severity and urgency and urging lawyers to take a climate-conscious approach to their practice. Now, we have the roadmap for solutions with the Paris Agreement, where the world's governments have already agreed to transition to net zero emissions economies and limit warming to well below 2 degrees and to strive for 1.5 degrees to avoid the most catastrophic impacts. This means we need to halve emissions within the next decade, which will require systems transmissions in energy, land use, industrials, transport, how we produce and consume, and how we practice law. And clients want lawyers who can help them navigate the disruptions from the climate crisis and achieve their climate goals. So today, our panelists are here to share with you their tangible examples of their legal practices and how they're collaborating inside and outside the profession to address the climate emergency. I'd like to take a brief moment to introduce our partners. So the partners for the event today, we have the Chancery Lane Project and London Climate Action Week. So London Climate Action Week, it actually kicks off today with harnesses the power of London towards global climate action. There's 70 events over the next 3 days for this first instalment of this virtual London Climate Action Week, focusing on green investment to rebuild economies, international collaboration for the climate crisis, and solutions for adaptation and resilience. So I'd encourage you to take a look. And the Chancery Lane Project, you'll hear some more about that today, but this is a pro bono initiative that uses the power of lawyers' pro bono time to collaborate across the profession to rewire contracts and laws to help tackle the climate crisis. And they have an announcement today on some hackathons this week. So I'm going to take a moment to introduce you to the panelists. And just as I introduce you, if I could just ask if they could unmute and say hello so we can connect faces to the panelists. So first off, we have Simon Davis, and he's the president of the Law Society of England and Wales. Simon?
Good afternoon, everybody.
Terrific, thank you. And Matthew Gingell, the chair of the Chancery Lane Project and general counsel at Oxygen House in his day job.
Hi, Ellie. Hi, everyone.
Hi, And Silky Goldberg. Silky's the chair of the Legal Response International and a partner at law firm Herbert Smith's Freehills.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone.
And Mark Campanale, he's our non-lawyer in the room, which we're delighted to have. Mark's the founder and executive chair of Carbon Tracker Initiative.
Hi there, thank you for having me on.
And Lima Pimentel Garcia, the head of environment law at Matos Filho and the senior vice chair of the International Bar Association Environment, Health and Safety Committee.
Hello, good morning from Brazil. Happy to meet you there. Thank you.
Thank you, Lena. Now, I've been very brief. I haven't done biographies, but these are very esteemed panelists, so please do look them up if you're interested. So moving on to the agenda for today, we're going to hear from our speakers. There'll be a panel discussion. It's going to be very discursive, collaborative, and we'll be discussing, there won't be many slides, only where they'll really help out and move forward the discussion. So we encourage you to submit questions via the Q&A function in the bottom of your screen. Please note, as we heard from the voice at the start, the webinar will be recorded, including the Q&A portion of the event. So you're very much encouraged to submit questions, but please note that your name and question will be visible when you do. Okay, so let's get started to hear from an expert. So Simon, as president of the Law Society of England and Wales, I was hoping you could share with us how the Law Society views the climate emergency and what it's doing as a professional body to tackle the climate crisis, and what impact the climate crisis has had on the profession so far. Simon, we've got you on mute.
So I thought you were unmuting. In that case, that's...
We can hear you now. That's terrific. Thank you.
Fine. Well, thank you very much indeed, Ellie. And that nice introduction immediately gave me the opportunity to make clear I am not an expert in climate change or the environment or environmental law, but I don't need to be. And none of us need to be. I'm going to come back to that right at the end of my opening remarks because it is so important. I think this session is a really timely reminder that we must make sure that we do not allow this shocking virus to push everything else to the boundaries. If I were to go back a little bit in time, and I can remember it quite clearly because I was talking to law firms and looking at their challenges across the piece at the beginning of this year. And if you were to talk, as I did, to those firms and to ask them what they considered, I'm going to use a whole series of the letter P. What were their priorities for the period ahead? And interesting enough, the P, which I heard very little about, was profit. That may come as a surprise, but I think the reason why profit featured so little in the discussions I had was because the future for activities, for people and businesses, was bright. And activities leads to work for law firms. So the future, I think, in terms of profit for most, was bright. So the P's actually that they were focusing on were purpose, people, and planet. And that's serious. And most of the firms I was speaking to were very conscious of the need for their firms, indeed like many companies and banks, to show that they have a social purpose running through their organization and that they're looking after their people's physical and mental health and the planet. And if you were to look right now at many of the law firms' websites, but you could have seen those before the crisis, there is no shortage of materials there about what firms are doing in relation to reducing carbon emissions, making sure there's effective waste management, and dealing with the kind of issues that you'd expect to see of a company, but also outward-looking advice. So coming therefore to the Law Society, I'm pleased to say that something we haven't had to do was to say to people, are you aware there's a problem with the climate? I think something really healthy has happened in terms of much of the debate. People are not now talking about, is there a risk to our climate? Is there a problem? Are there things we should be doing about it? All that discussion's gone now. And I think it's come down to the sole question. What are we all doing about it? Which is a much more interesting discussion and much more relevant one to be having. In relation to the Law Society's reaction to the crisis, I mean, our role at all times has got to be to do exactly what it says on our tin in terms of what is our statement, what is our mission. And I'll read it. Our purpose is to be the voice of solicitors, to drive excellence in the profession, and to safeguard the rule of law, which fits absolutely perfectly with everything that we are now talking about. In relation to voice, I'm really pleased to see that you've got a number of people from outside this jurisdiction who are attending this discussion. Last year, when we were all able to meet together in real life, we had the meeting of the G7 bar leaders in Paris before the G7 actual meeting of the leaders in August. Right at the top of the resolutions which were passed by the 7 bar leaders urging governments to take steps about was the environment, and seeing what steps are being taken by governments together with their legal communities to have in place practical legal measures to safeguard the planet. So the international voice is very important. More on the domestic stage, we are part of and one of the founders of the Legal Sustainability Alliance. That's now more than 180 law firms who gather together to deal with what is actually happening within their own law firms, what are the law firms actually doing about contributing to the saving of the planet, but also what can be done to help their clients in relation to that. So just right now, I think this Monday was a webinar with some top experts about how to look at the practical policy, legal and financial changes which you need to get a proper incentivization regime in place for renewables. So again, inward and outward. We have now coming through the environmental bill, and we're working very closely on that with our experts from our committee at the Law Society, again, to make sure this is a statute which has not just a purpose, but actually has some bite. Because as we all know, as we have left the European Union, the government's position is there are a series of red lines. And one of those red lines is that we will not have any influence on us by the European Court of Justice. So therefore, that means we have something which needs to substitute for that. We've got the Office of Environmental Protection, but are we just going to be left with some kind of, the only remedy is what I call the remedy of please go and think again remedy, judicial review. There's all kinds of really interesting work being done out there in relation to challenges to make sure that human rights, because of course we talk about environment, but environment and human rights are absolutely mutually entangled. There was the case earlier this year in Holland with its top court saying that actually the aspirations which have been set by the Dutch government for carbon emission reduction, 20%, was not enough. It should be 25%. That's really interesting. Courts getting involved under the appropriate banner of human rights. And I think we're going to see probably quite a lot more of that. We are, I'm going to use as gentle a word as possible, which is really supporting, because the work which Matt Gingell is going to talk about in relation to Chancery Lane, and ours has been the lightest touch, hoping to take as much credit as we possibly can for Matt's brilliant work. That's a sort of a light-hearted remark, but that's the kind of thing with the Law Society really, really pleased to be involved with, and you'll hear from Matt about that. And I'll conclude with, as I said at the beginning, which is that sometimes people are put off getting involved in environmental law issues or human rights because they think, I'm not an expert, I've got nothing to contribute. We should all be human rights lawyers, all environmental rights lawyers, even if you know nothing, which is Simon Davis. That shouldn't stop you getting stuck in enthusiastically in helping those who know what they're talking about. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. You said you weren't an expert, but you did cite the agenda decision, so I'm going to give you some points for that. You've introduced the Chancery Lane Project, so now might be a good time to move over to Matt to hear about a little bit more about the Chancery Lane Project. Matt, I work with you. I know that you are the chair, the brains behind this idea. Please tell us more.
Well, thanks, Ellie, and thanks, esela, for inviting me to this panel. The Chancery Lane Project is not about individuals. It's not about me. I'm here to talk about it. It's about the collective effort of the profession to make a difference. And similar to Simon, I always feel like a bit of a fraud talking about this subject because I'm not an environmental or climate change lawyer, and I don't work for an NGO. I feel myself as a normal in-house corporate commercial lawyer who works for a profit-making group. I suppose I just care. So that's a bit about me to set the tone. So a bit about the Chancery Lane Project. Well, I'm going to start at the beginning and canter through the last 12 months, because unbelievably, it's only been 12 months since we convened the project. And it was this time last year that I was actually physically, real life, attending events at London Climate Action Week, which seems impossible now and even a lifetime ago. And as you would expect, there were really amazing speakers, and I met some inspirational lawyers. And I left buoyed with hope that we can solve the issues of the day around climate change, and that there were plenty of lawyers and law firms showing true leadership on climate change. But then on the way home, it kind of dawned on me that I've had this feeling before, and that we keep having the same conversations at these events, and perhaps nothing is really changing. So as such, I felt this kind of overwhelming sense of inertia about progress. And that's not a criticism of anyone or any firm or the legal profession, but I think it's a matter of available time, particularly for the business of law, where time is literally money. So it made me think that we needed to change the paradigm. We need to accelerate everything we do. We need practical output. And at one of the events last year, the ocean explorer Penn Haddo finished with almost a throwaway comment to say, we need a Manhattan Project for climate change. Now, he didn't mean we need to create more weapons of mass destruction, but his analogy was true, because what he was saying is that we need the focus and urgency of the Manhattan Project, using the best and brightest minds to solve the issue of the day, being climate change. So I started thinking about what could we do as a profession? How can we collaborate and innovate in a way that produces practical solutions? How can we use our legal skills that we've spent so long perfecting to mitigate climate change in a politically and professionally neutral manner? What would happen if we convened a diverse range of bright legal minds to focus on combating climate change? So I sent what now seems like a crazy email to Ellie, Simon, and some others about the project concept, and others that I met at London Climate Action Week 2019. And it ended with one of those lines that says, as always, there will be a lot of detail to work out, good reasons not to do it, and barriers to overcome. But I am up for the challenge if you are. And I hadn't quite realised how true this would be, but I think the results now speak for themselves. And I think it's that we're throwing down a challenge of kind of leadership, creativity, and innovation to the profession who wants to be involved in this. And it's genuinely heartening to see that our profession wants to take the lead on this, wants to contribute pro bono time, and wants to be involved in the solutions. So at the end of July 2019, we convened a steering committee, and the Chancery Lane Project became the code name for the idea to convene the best and brightest legal minds to create the contracts and laws required to fight climate change. So today, our vision is a world where every contract and law enables solutions to climate change, a world in which legal frameworks enable and encourage businesses and communities to have a positive impact on the environment. Our purpose, therefore, is to help create practical legal solutions to reverse climate change using collaborative problem solving. In effect, we rewire contracts and laws to create new market norms for us to use. So how do we do this? Well, first we convene and inspire a diverse range of lawyers from across the profession. And last November, we hosted our first legal hackathon. It had 120 lawyers from 63 different organisations and the full spectrum of the legal profession. We had barristers, in-house lawyers, private practice lawyers, and legal academics, all working on solutions that lawyers can implement today. And in fact, we have, and I'm going to plug it, we have our 2-day legal hackathon starting tomorrow, and you can sign up via our website if you want to get involved. But again, these events are designed to be practical, and they're designed to create and enable output and solutions. So we've co-created what we call a climate contract playbook, which is a book of precedent clauses that we can all use to help our clients and help our firms get to net zero. We've also published a green paper of model laws. And I'm excited to say that the second edition of the playbook, which has been co-created during lockdown, is available on our website to download for free today. And then third, it's up to all of us to promote and deploy these clauses, encouraging our clients where it's aligned with their objectives to get involved. And this is something we should all do. And that was echoed by the IBA last month. And finally, we want our work to create new market norms to bring around about this wider change and ensure we have that lasting positive impact. So as you might be able to tell, the project is a bit different. It's not about individuals or organisations or founders, and no one person or organisation has all the answers. I certainly don't, and we all need to work together, and it's about that collective effort in finding them. But I truly believe that as lawyers, we can make a difference. So today we've got over 400 participants from 115 organisations, and the first editions have been downloaded all over the world. So I'd encourage you to get involved in the hack tomorrow. There's so much more I could say. I could talk for hours on this project. I just completely enthusiastic about it.
I'm going to interrupt you there.
But I will finish. I will finish by saying 2020 has understandably not been the year of clarity and action on climate change we wanted. But history reminds us that with shared purpose and working together, we can navigate uncertainty, whatever its nature. As such, I'm positive that the legal profession can and will help mitigate climate change through collaborative drafting. So to put it simply, if I want you to remember one thing today, is if we change the precedent, we can change the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. You've just been so positive and talking about this collaboration and innovation together. But you did mention in your first email back those 12 months ago that there might be a few barriers. Have you found with the Chancery Lane Project that there's been barriers to lawyers' involvement, and how have these been overcome?
Yeah, I think as a profession, we're not that brilliant about putting ourselves out there to fail, and we want to perfect everything, and that is because we want to do the best job for our client. So I make no apology for that, but it can stifle innovation. So one of the things we really wanted to create was this really safe space for innovation, and to make the most of people's time. And that's where this hackathon idea came, because it allows this safe space to innovate in a political and professionally neutral way. So we had NGO in-house lawyers collaborating with corporate lawyers from global practices and their in-house colleagues, and it was just really exciting and magic to watch. And I think it did change that paradigm, but we've got so much more work to do. So we produced this really great output, but now we've all got to use it, and we've got to start working towards it. But I think it's also explaining how clients and climate are already aligned. So 81% of the FTSE 100 have already set a carbon emissions reduction target. That is an objective of that business. As lawyers, we meet our clients' objectives. It's completely aligned with business, the business of law, and the planet. And that's where it's hit the really sweet spot, because everybody can see how it aligns with their day-to-day, and that gives them the purpose that Simon was talking about.
Terrific. Thanks, Matt. Now I might ask if we can shift geographies, jurisdictions, but with that real focus on collaboration and lawyering in a little bit of a different way. Lena, could you share about your work in Brazil, working with Commitment for Climate or Commitment to Climate? Oh, you're on mute. Yeah. Wonderful, thank you.
Okay. I have some graphics, and then I can share with you. I don't know if we're gonna put here in the presentation, but we have a project in which, as a law firm, I am a representative of the environmental practice in a law firm, the biggest law firm in Brazil. We have structured a sustainability team, which instead a specific practice, or for example, environmental health and safety practice, we gather together 7 practices: real estate, labor, funds and capital markets, tax, insurance, environment, of course, and actually capital markets and funds are different practices. So we put all this practice together in order to train lawyers to be sustainability lawyers rather than their own original practice. This is quite new for us. And in order to make sure that we will be engaged to this kind of different projects, that we cannot charge regular fees as we used to charge for our regular clients, and at the same time, it's not pro bono, because as you're going to see, please switch to the next slide. As you're going to see, our clients are not the companies itself. Our client is the project. This is beautiful. This is something different that I have been seeing in my practice. So B3 that you can see there, it's the stock exchange of our country in Brazil. Itaú is the biggest bank. Lojas Renner is a retail general company of business. Matos Filho, of course, my firm. MRV, it's a huge logistic and infrastructure company. Natura, it's I think they are now together with the Body Shop, so you know them. And Droga Raia, it's a life science company. So Ecos Brazil is the NGO that has been coordinating this initiative. And so we put all these companies together in order to develop a platform in which we are going to assess and provide legal due diligence over projects for carbon exchange, carbon offset. So we receive the projects, we put together a group of lawyers, a very efficient group of lawyers, to check out the labor and corporate and tax and all the things related to the project. And then we issue a legal opinion by saying that that project is fine. They comply with not only legal aspects, but reputational aspects throughout the structure of the project. And then everyone can buy their carbon credits in order to neutralize, to offset their emissions. So it's still carbon credits, but we still believe that carbon credits, it's the basic initiative for companies that want to fight or to tackle climate change. So it was difficult for us as lawyers in a big law firm, which has expensive rates, to build a project in which we are going to charge low rates for this kind of projects, because our pro bono regulation in Brazil only allow us as lawyers to work for free for institutions that doesn't have any kind of way for paying our fees. So we cannot say that these companies that are huge companies doesn't have conditions to pay legal fees. But of course, it's not a project in which we can charge the regular fees. So it was different in our firm to establish this practice of sustainability, in which you're going to have like 20 lawyers from different practice, which are trained to be climate change lawyers or human rights lawyers. I can remember a professor in my law school 20 years ago saying that all the practices of law will end up below 2 main laws, which is human rights and climate change. I think this time has arrived, and we need to understand how we move in this new situation. So what I would like to say is that if you are in a big law firm, you need to find a way to build within the law firm strategies to have them the lawyers working in this kind of projects. And this was my way of doing this. And as a private lawyer and corporate lawyer, I also put 20% at least of my time to work as a pro bono job in the IBA, which also makes lots of sense to do everything I can towards tackling the climate change. So we need to find, according to our practicing, we need to find a way to devote most of our time, or at least part of our time, to climate change law, which is kind of a new practice that we need to understand how we're going to explore. So this is the project, yeah.
Thank you, Lena. Could I ask, so I didn't share detailed bios, but I know that you used to work at Greenpeace, but now you're the head of environment at a very large commercial law firm in Brazil. Could you share about how your background informs your current climate work?
Yes. When I was 16, I heard an expert in Brazil, a lawyer, by saying that we need to reduce the emissions, we need to control the temperature, and I am 40, so I was 16. And I said, okay, I've learned and understood that I have to work with that matter because it makes sense. It's based on science, the same science that support our understanding of climate law today. So it was 23 years ago, 25 years ago, the same. And that's why I decided to work with environmental law. And in Brazil, 23 years ago, we didn't have like lots of practice in that field. And I've learned that Greenpeace, it's a preference. And I knocked their door and said, please, I'm here. I do journalist and I do law school. I do both. I can work in both sides with you. What can I do? And I remember the president of Greenpeace by saying, you have 3 months to tell me what I'm going to do here, because I don't know, you have 18 years old, I don't know what to do with you. I said, okay. And I spent many years working for them directly, internally, just a year. And then I switched to the law firm that worked for them and for AIDS, for SIDA, matter in Brazil. And then I switched to a big law firm at that time. And we started to work with environmental law for corporate, and but also working for Greenpeace for half of the legal fees. And then I decided to go to the government. So I decided that in 10 years, I would like to spend an experience in every perspective of practicing law. So NGO, corporate firms, and public agency. I worked as an in-house counsel in the state agency of environmental in the state of São Paulo. It's the biggest agency. And then I decided to go to an ethanol and energy company in the middle west of Brazil to manage a sustainability area. And then after these 10 years of experience, I decided to move again to the corporate firm in order to change things as much as I could, because I like to practice law, I like to solve problems, and I like to change places in which I am. So I'm really tired sometimes, because practicing this for 23 years, knowing that it's the science, the same science, and seeing the inertia that Matthew said. But well, I think the young people help us in believing that things are changing and that we can change and we can help with our experience. But we need to focus. We need to materialize things. Otherwise, we will be thinking and not doing. So congratulations for all these initiatives.
Yeah, you're so right to be focused. And I think it's really interesting the way in which you've connected. You were operating in the same paradigm, whether it is, from an NGO, whether you're a corporate lawyer, whether you're working in-house in government. The facts of the world are the same. And that's a really powerful message that we need to be responding to those. Now I just would like to bring you to the IBA's climate crisis statement, because you have a lead role in one of the IBA's committees. So this statement, it came out on the 5th of May. If anyone hasn't seen it already, I hope you have. I hope it's done its job to give the legal profession a shake-up. But if you could share, like, what does the statement mean for how lawyers should approach their practice? How have you seen how the legal community's responded, and what should we do next because of what this statement now?
Yeah, well, IBA has many years. They were created together with the United Nations. So it is a traditional way of practicing law and talking about the voice of the legal profession and everything. So change there are not that easy. And when we decided to prepare this statement, this was a result of a task force for climate justice that we spent 3 or 4 years working on that by understanding what are the connections between the committees, among the committees at IBA. So we put everyone together, we built a special group in which we disclosed a report that we have the information of this report also in the website. And it was quite difficult within the CERIL. CERIL is the section for energy and natural resources that comprises 6 committees. The committees are power, construction, water, oil and gas, mining, and EHS committee. But we were quite alone as the EHS committee by saying the climate change and the regulation, we need to push, we need to move forward. And the other 5 committees was, okay, but we have the commodity price and we have this and this and this and that and that for many years. So we spent 10 years by saying this loudly, that we need to cross our practices seriously. And then we end up establishing after the statement, together with the construction of the statement, we built the event of Marrakesh. We can send you the details around here, but the Marrakesh event was going to happen in May, now just May, and because the crisis, we are converting the event into a webinar for August or September. I will let you know. And the idea was to build this cross-reference between the 6 committees. And finally, I can tell you that all the 6 committees are looking to the same direction. So the name of the event was the Era of Decarbonization. And the first plenary, the plenary that I was going to mediate, was exactly the connection between the science and the decision makers, which is quite obvious for us that work with that. But I think that it's not obvious for everyone in terms of climate change, that we have the conclusion in the scientific field that it's obvious. So we were about to have this event, and all the other sessions by the other committees has just the only purpose of discussing climate change within the mining, the oil and gas, and everything. So for it's enormous. This is enormous for IBA, and this is enormous the impact that we have in the law firms, because IBA is mainly composed of huge law firms throughout the world. So when you have the leader of the mining industry in a British law firm conducting the session of decarbonization and everything, so you are making a lot of change. So that's why I devote this part of my time to IBA, that we must believe that it makes sense.
Yeah, the IBA is an opportunity to collaborate across the profession globally. Silky, could I bring you in here? So you are a UK-based energy lawyer. Could you share your experiences with the IBA climate crisis statement? So what's that meant for your firm? Because we've heard from Lena, particularly around her involvement with the IBA. What's it meant for your firm, the work that you're doing, and also others who might not have been perhaps as attuned to the climate crisis?
Thank you, Ellie, and thank you. I find it really fascinating to hear from other participants, and also there seems to be a real enthusiasm, and echoing Simon's point about there needs to be a certain amount of enthusiasm, even if people are perhaps not yet experts in this area, is immensely important. Actually, it's also one of the things, and I start with that before coming to your question, Ellie. I sometimes interview, I'm part of our graduate entry interview scheme, and the first question that prospective trainees ask us often, what do you do about climate change? Do you do any pro bono? How does it work? How can I get involved? Yes, they want to know about how the training contract works, obviously, and what they have to do and what's the work going to be like. But when it comes to the point, is there anything you want to know of us? That is very often one of the key questions. So enthusiasm and inspiring young people to get involved in this area, super important. And clearly also there is a push factor sort of from new entrants in the profession. How does Herbert Smith Freehills, or how does my own practice look like, and sort of how does that relate to the climate crisis? It's probably fair to say that Herbert Smith Freehills has been involved in the whole climate change and decarbonisation area for sort of matter for a really long period of time. We're one of the founding members of the Legal Response Initiative, or the Legal Response International, and together with other law firms in the city, barrister chambers, and indeed law firms across the world. We saw very early on that there was a need to support least developed countries in particular, but also NGOs as part of the UNFCCC negotiations, and to make sure that those delegations who don't have, in fact, a whole army of lawyers behind them and technical specialists who come to those negotiations and need legal support, we wanted to help make sure that they had that support, and that's why we didn't hesitate for a second when we were asked would we like to join this new initiative, and we've been a part of that for the past 10 years. At the moment we have, I'm just double checking, I think on my internal mailing list I have around 70 volunteers across the whole range, from trainees to partners who regularly participate and assist in answering questions. So we've been involved for a really long time in this area, sort of both from a pro bono perspective, but also from an internal training perspective. We do deliver a fair amount of training specifically around matters that pertain to decarbonisation, renewable energy, and climate change. But also throughout this time, what we have seen, and similarly to Lena, I come from a slightly different background. Prior to sort of working in law, I worked as part of, I worked for the Energy Committee in the European Parliament. And I was involved with the very first roadmap for renewable energy. And this is how I got completely hooked on the energy sector, I'm afraid. So sort of coming from that perspective, I've been personally involved in this sector for a really long period of time. And from that time, I could see in the early 2000s, in broader society, but also in law firms, it was a bit like, oh, renewable energy, this is sort of for tree huggers. This is sort of, this is a new thing. This is, how can you ever make money with this? It's fine. It's fine for if you're sort of super green, but well, let's see how that goes. Well, now the tables have completely turned, of course. Not only is renewable energy now mainstream energy. In some countries, there's more than 50% of the energy mix is renewable energy now. And clients from really sort of all backgrounds start to get really interested how they can invest in green energy sources, how they can decarbonize their businesses, and how they can sort of get into matters that pertain perhaps to carbon credits, which was mentioned already, how they can comply with all of these disclosure schemes, for instance, the EU taxonomy. This morning I gave a webinar to a client who said we need to learn more about the EU taxonomy on disclosure on ESG, environment, social and governance issues. And more people are getting involved in this and interested. And I think the point that Lena and Matthew that you both made earlier about how clients and climate objectives are increasingly aligned is a really important one.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Silky. So can I ask, your pro bono practice with the LRI and then your energy practice, which has a very large renewable energy focus to it, do you see them as completely separate hats, or can you always find a coherent thread for climate solutions, or mostly, or is there times that you kind of sometimes have to be balancing out?
Mm-hmm. I mean, obviously they compete for time, of course, that's one thing. But broadly they are aligned, or they're in quite separate spheres. I mean, sort of in my commercial practice, I will sort of advise clients on, I don't know, make an example, how to develop a wind farm or a wind project. And whereas in the LRI, the question will be around from an international law perspective, is it lawful to express this particular commitment, or how do you reconcile a particular commitment? How do you translate a certain policy desire into international law? So they have a slightly different focus, but they're not in contradiction with each other. And indeed, there is, I would say, a fertile cross-pollination between the two. Sometimes sort of their ideas that I'm working on a commercial project and think, oh, I wonder how that might be useful there, or vice versa. So not at all contradictory, I would say.
Terrific. Just before we move on to Mark Campanale, so talking fossil fuels, I'm going to take a moment to open up a question to you about fossil fuels, and particularly in the context of the graduate recruitment that you do. And people say, well, what do you do on climate? And when I started many moons ago at my firm, a different commercial firm, and tobacco was one area that the client did have a few very big multinational tobacco clients, but it was something that you were allowed to opt out of, and you were not at all seen to be the grad that, you know, like it was the one thing that you could not stay till midnight for. There was no questions asked if you said, I can't do tobacco. Do you think we might get to a stage one day where young lawyers coming in, or, you know, lawyers of any age might say, I don't want to do fossil fuels anymore? Do you think that we might see that?
I have to say, I haven't seen that yet. And also, not doing fossil fuels or not doing fossil fuel clients is also a question, because many of these fossil fuel clients, or the carbon majors as they're sometimes called, are now in fact investing more and more in green energy.
The transition work.
So that there is a huge amount of instructions that come from the carbon majors at the moment is all about energy transition. So I can't see young lawyers opting out of that sort of thing in a hurry.
Yeah, terrific. So we think that there's a much more nuanced conversation there around doing the transition work for energy companies rather than just the fossil fuels. Mark, I'm going to bring you in here. So let's have a fossil fuel conversation. You're a non-lawyer expert on Carbon Tracker Initiative. So could you tell us about the industry side and your work on the phase out of fossil fuels, please? And I think you have some slides for us.
I do. Thank you for that. So for those that don't know Carbon Tracker, we're a non-profit financial think tank. I spent 20 years working in the City of London in asset management, setting up the first of the ecological funds back in the 1980s and early 1990s. Today, most of the analysts that I've hired, there's 32 of us now between London and New York, have spent time working either in Wall Street or in the City of London. We've got the old head of research for Citigroup. We've got the co-head of oil and gas for HSBC. We've got the guys who used to invest Barclays' balance sheet into oil and gas projects. So the idea was to take the experts who understand energy from the financial markets perspective and bring that knowledge about the financing of fossil fuels into understanding the energy transition. So what I'm going to talk about today is something which is actually is a surprise to a lot of people. That those familiar with the Paris Climate Agreement will know that, of course, it doesn't mention fossil fuels anywhere in it. It's an emissions reduction agreement. It's not an attempt to control the supply of fossil fuels. It's an attempt to reduce emissions. Now, because of that, we often find ourselves playing a game of football, but to the rules of cricket. We're trying to address climate change by reducing emissions, when actually, in my view, the risks and the problems are associated with what's happening in the fossil fuel industry. We heard the comment earlier about the oil and gas majors, but on a relative basis, most of the investment into clean energy, about 95% of it globally, is in fact made by investors other than the traditional carbon majors. Most of the investments are being made by financial investors and others. And that's why Carbon Tracker published just recently a paper entitled "Why None of the Oil and Gas Companies Are Paris Aligned." So here's the data which I'm going to talk about how we can go about addressing this. Those familiar with the science of carbon budgets will know that the world has we can release somewhere between, depending on probability to avoid 1.5 degrees, we have somewhere around 300 to 900 gigatons of CO2 that we can release to the atmosphere. And what you're looking at here, I'm going to point you to a series of horizontal lines along the bottom. The lowest horizontal line looks at the declining remaining carbon budget to 1.5 degrees, with a higher probability, 66% probability. And then the bar above that represents, this is on the horizontal, a declining carbon budget associated with 2 degrees. We're currently emitting around 40 gigatons of carbon dioxide per annum. And remember that figure that I gave you of around 500, depending on the probabilities, we have between 7 and 15 years left, based on current emissions before we go through the concentrations of CO2 associated with 1.5 degrees, and then around 30 years before we go through 2 degrees, and then not much after that we go through 3. Now, those from familiar with the science know we haven't seen those levels of warmings for hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years. And so the fact that we know that we're likely to go through that in the next 10, 15 years is quite sobering. So what else are we looking at on this graph? The vertical bars represent the proven reserves of coal, which is in the red, the proven reserves of gas, which is in the darker color, and the proven reserves of oil. And it's just a very simple statement that we've got 7 times more proven reserves of coal, oil, and gas than we can possibly burn to stay within the Paris goals. So now, if you speak to the companies, which we do pretty regularly, they are almost along the line board think that demand for oil and gas is going up, and so they plan to produce more. So when we hear about these de-intensification measures announced by some of the oil majors, what they're doing is they are introducing more gas into the mix and some more renewables, and each unit of energy sold is less carbon intensive, but overall they're planning to produce more. So we have this very sort of simple statement that you can't meet the goals of the Paris Agreement whilst producing more fossil fuels. It's just that it doesn't add up. And if you look at negative emissions technologies, we've calculated you need 300 carbon capture and storage units a year, built every year for 10 years. And after you've done that, we're currently building about 4 or 5 a year. And after you've done that, you only have 15 years more left before we'll have to start all over again. So it's not a panacea. So we've gone to the next slide. So what I'm going to suggest today is something which is, again, thank you, which is pretty obvious. It's not illegal to produce fossil fuels. It's just a fact. We may try and put carbon pricing in. We may try and put in nature-based solutions or CCS just to continue as business as usual. But it's not illegal to be a fossil fuel producer. And any company can say to their shareholders, oh, we're Paris aligned, and whilst increasing production, without there really being any kind of metric or test. So a number of us have got together, and what we're alluding to is a situation very similar to the nuclear non-proliferation treaties of the 1970s and 80s, where the Russians counted how many missiles they had. The Americans did the same, the Chinese did too, and so did the Brits, and they allowed independent, objective assessors. And then they came around the table one year, and the Americans said, well, we've got 6,000, and the Russians said, well, I think we've got the same. And you have this phrase, mutual assured destruction, and then began the process of actually the Russians and the Americans, well, we know Trump's just dismissed it, but beginning the process of retiring nuclear weapons. And we think a very similar approach is needed to fossil fuels. We need to put fossil fuels and the production of it back into the heart of international climate agreements. And we propose the creation of a global registry. Carbon Tracker, if you're familiar with it, carbontracker.org, we actually produce data on who's producing the fossil fuels, what breaches the Paris Agreement, what's the capital expenditure associated with it. So we produce a global registry, every government submits the data. There's the evidence of the 7 times more fossil fuels. And then we can have the honest and serious discussion as to who retires what and when. And no, unlike we know the Brits were still compensating or paying off the compensation for the slave trade less than 10 years ago through the gilt market, that there's no intention to compensate producers for the very simple reason that 80% of the world's population lives in energy importing countries. Just 7% of the population are responsible for producing most of the world's fossil fuels. So we're not intending compensation, but what we're looking at is a energy transition that's based on principles of justice for every community and worker. And go to fossilfueltreaty.org, and I'll stop there. It's not day to day what we do at Carbon Tracker, but I'm proposing it as an idea where the excellent skills of lawyers listening to this can bring their expertise to start talking to governments. We've already spoken to quite a few governments around this idea to actually how we bring this into the Paris climate agreement, and actually how we stop the oversupply of fossil fuels that will dangerously take us past 1.5 degrees.
Terrific. Thank you, Mark. I'm going to use this opportunity now to bring in some of our Q&A questions. You've put this fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty on the table, and we've had some questions around some equally radical ideas, particularly ecocide. And so we look at the criminalisation of conduct that harms the environment, causes catastrophic climate change. And so I'm going to open up to Mark. Have you heard about these? Have you heard about ecocide? Does that fit with your radical idea with the treaty? You think something like that is needed?
Yes, I have heard of this, and I'm not going down that line myself, but I do think that the producers of fossil fuels have to take legal responsibility for their products. It happens in any other kind of consumer law, where if your product that you sell is tainted or contaminated, you're responsible for that. I think we have to take the same approach to fossil fuels. There is a terrific analyst called Rick Heady from the University of Minnesota with his Climate Accountability Project, where he calculated that 70% of atmospheric CO2 is down to 100 companies. And The Guardian published it, if you remember, just a few years ago. And he's developing some legal ideas around those 100 corporations taking back responsibility for that 70% of the world's emissions. And ultimately, maybe there will be a lawsuit brought against them for their products.
I mean, the lawsuits are already being brought. They're just, we haven't had judgments so far for that kind of attribution of their products to causing climate change. Could I ask, so we've had a bunch of questions around ecocide. So it's this idea of bringing in new laws. About just 2 days ago, the French President Macron expressed some support for pushing ecocide at an international level and also exploring it in French law. And then we've had another question also, though, rather than using new laws to criminalise this conduct, we've got John from the Climate Genocide Act Now team, and they're looking to get law enforcement agencies here in the UK to use existing legislation to prosecute climate criminals. And so they've approached the Met Office to commence criminal investigation against Prime Ministers under the ICC Act. Simon, could I open to you about that UK law question of the existing criminal law? And then also if you'd like to talk about perhaps new laws like ecocide?
Let me sort of say yes and no, because actually there was a question on the chat which I really do want to answer. So I'm going to answer that if that's okay, which is about how questions of the environment shouldn't just be put as a CSR issue, which I think is a really great question. I think what I want to answer just in relation to just generally to the particular questions. I said I'm not an expert on the actual area of the law, but I think you find with so many things in the law, and indeed more generally in society, when something is seen to be working, often the first step is, that's not working, we must try something else, something brand new, which by and large brings with it unintended consequences and harms often the very people they were trying to help. So what I would say, just a general answer to the question, is that my starting point would be to look very, very closely at the existing laws that we have and see if they're capable of being applied to deal with the position which we have. That would be my starting point philosophically. So in relation to the question about should we be having new laws, I would certainly be starting with what we have at the moment. But just in relation to the really good question about whether we should make sure this is more than CSR, I think Silke was absolutely right. At one stage, you'd find that environment and human rights, if you go to many universities, and probably right now, you'd find the lecture rooms packed with students on human rights and the environment. And you say to them, what do you want to do in your life? I want to be a human rights lawyer. I want to be an environmental lawyer. And they come out and go, oh, there don't seem to be many jobs in that. And then think, well, maybe I can do that as a bit of a sideline. No. Here's a wonderful opportunity. The clients, Matt will be able to tell you about this. Law firms are client pleasers. Clients want to absolutely be in the foremost of this discussion, even if they fall into the category of so-called polluters or bad ones. They want to be right at the heart of this. So if your clients want to be, then the law firms will want to be. So anybody who's coming out of university right now and saying, I'd really like to be an environmental lawyer or a human rights lawyer, go apply to almost any firm and say something when you're applying, not just I'm really interested in environmental law, but talk about how clients want this to be at the heart of everything they're doing, why you have an interest in it, why you have a skill which is going to be of assistance in that. And before you know it, you may go to a firm which has almost none of that kind of practice, but you're going to be able to breathe life into it. So absolutely don't allow this to become just another, ooh, that's a really interesting CSR. This must run through the whole thread of the firm, and it will do when they have people like Matt who says, I'm not going to hire you unless you subscribe to XYZ.
Thanks, Simon. Silky, could I ask your thoughts on integrating it mainstream in your firm? And perhaps if you also wanted to, we had so many questions on ecocide. So if you do want to let us know your thoughts on integrate it in your mainstream practice, and then these kind of arguments that shift the Overton window around the criminalisation of conduct and how you're engaging with those.
Okay. How to integrate it in the mainstream. I think I work at a fairly mainstream law firm and in a fairly mainstream practice, so at the heart of the city doing corporate law. It is absolutely, sort of, I think what Simon says is absolutely right. So clients are paying more and more attention to ESG, to environment, to the energy transition, to decarbonisation strategies. In fact, I would say I spend probably a good 30% of my time talking to clients about decarbonisation strategies, how they're going to approach climate issues, and how they can comply and how they can come to a 1.5 degree sort of scenario and be Paris Agreement compliant. That takes up a huge amount of my time. And I'm pretty sure, and Simon will know more about this, that this is, we're not the only firm doing this. So we're sort of both, it's not, I'm not claiming sort of a unique position here. So I think that trend becomes stronger, and it is absolutely client driven as well. In terms of client inquiries, we also increasingly, our clients asking us, can we please declare our own scope 3 emissions? Can we sort of disclose what we're doing internally? So it is a huge focus that law firms across the spectrum will have to address. What do I think about legal initiatives and sort of to criminalize or do other things in relation to particular behaviors? I would say this: environmental law and already has criminal teeth attached to it, at least in the European Union. So I'm an English lawyer, but I'm also a German lawyer, and environmental law in both jurisdictions has incredibly powerful teeth. It is not such that the existing law would need to be completely overhauled in order to make sure that environmental law is adhered to, first of all. So calling for new laws and sounds very good and sounds very catchy, but I think we do have a legal regime that in particular in relation to environment has already quite sort of a good enforcement mechanism behind that. I would also be and somebody mentioned the Urgenda case already at the beginning. I think it was Simon. The Urgenda case really shows that to a very large degree, the climate change framework, or the framework within which we all operate as lawyers, is politically driven, and there's a state responsibility. Going after individual companies because they may or may not have emitted something, and I'm well aware of the Richard Heath sort of study. That's one thing, but the issue is, and I'm not actually sure that is sort of necessarily driving to a good political outcome, because what the issue really is that you need a political framework that encourages compliance with the Paris Agreement, with the 1.5 degrees centigrade, and that's a task for politics.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Silky. I've had a question from Alexandra asking, and so this is going to be for all the panelists, so listen up. What is the one piece of information that the panelists would wish for individuals in the legal community to take home with them? So this could be anything. It could be a solution to a small problem, an initiative's existence, a statistic, a suggestion. And Alexandra has suggested that actually what Alexandra would like everyone to know is how massive the impact of cotton is on water consumption compared to various other materials, so we can make more informed decisions as consumers. And I'm going to suggest something Luke has his kind of suggestion for this is, would it help move the needle on climate change if law firms started to declare a climate emergency in greater numbers? So should we be debating that? So is that the thing that you're going to, that the one thing is the law firm climate emergency, or that's important, but something else? I'm going to open to Matt first.
Yeah, the one thing is that every contract makes a difference. And I mean that across every specialism. Our whole country, our whole society is built on this artificial matrix of contracts. And that's a human construct. And we can change that construct through the contracts we draft for our clients. And we have this incredible influence over the communities, the businesses, and the clients that we live and work and act for. Okay. I've also got some thoughts on ecocide if you want me to deal with it. So I really get the point about bringing in a new law, because as an in-house lawyer, I have seen the effect of the UK's gold-plated Bribery Act and GDPR. They basically become the board agenda for the next 2 years as you count down to implementation. So I actually believe that they're really powerful instruments of change. However, to get them enacted is really time consuming, because as Simon says, you have to make sure that there are no unintended consequences, and you have to get the political will behind it. But it makes me think, well, actually, you can reflect some of the outcomes you want to achieve through contracts. So can you write into a contract a clause that says, if there is an adverse environmental outcome as a result of our not fulfilling an obligation, then is there a contractual remedy under that, or a contractual cure that helps change the behaviour of the contracting parties to make sure the ecocide doesn't happen in the first place? And that's where a big part of the Chancery Lane Project is. Yes, we do model laws, but they take time to come into force, and it's time we haven't got. So what we try and do is drag back that impact curve towards net zero by using contracts to replicate what we want and what our clients want to happen.
Matt, while I've got you here, and just to give Silky and Mark and Simon another moment to think about their one thing, we've had a question that's been upvoted a bit on impact investing. So I wanted to put that to you in your role as General Counsel of Oxygen House. It says, do lawyers have a role in supporting the increase of funding towards responsible and impact investing? And if so, what's that role? And so this is a co-hosted event for esela, the Impact for to Network for Social Impact.
So absolutely, and it's easy for an impact investor to align their contracts with their objectives as an investor. I think the mainstreaming of ESG is becoming more on the agenda. I mean, you've got statements from the CEO of BlackRock saying climate change risk is investment risk. These are incredibly powerful statements, and what that does is it means it has to be on everybody's agenda. So I think it's you can start with the Chancery Lane Project. We always start with shades of green, so you can put as little as the investee company will set a net zero target that is aligned to UK government policy within 6 months of the investment. It can be as little as that. And what that does is it puts it on the agenda and shows to your investors that we put it on the agenda with our investee companies. So there's really small nudge things that you can do just to get it on the agenda, and that's the start of the conversation. But you need an investment mandate to do that, and you need the right kind of investment professionals to understand and be on board with that. So it's not something you can do on your own, but you certainly can influence it as well.
Fantastic. Silky, I'm going to ask you, what's the kind of one takeaway that for people, the one thing you want people to know about? Oh, have I lost Silky? Okay, I'm going to Mark.
Am I on mute?
You're off mute. We got you.
Okay, thank you. So for me, well, in our analysis at Carbon Tracker, we think there's something like $30 trillion of fixed assets in the fossil fuel economy that's going to have to be written down to be Paris aligned. And what we're hearing from companies is they're not taking these write-downs because they don't think Paris will ever be implemented. I don't think this is a prudent approach. Some have already taken write-downs. BP announced $17.5 billion the other week. Shell announced yesterday, I think, around $20 billion of write-downs. Now, if we take it right across the sector, pipelines, ORIGs, and so on, this is a considerable amount of reorganization of balance sheets. Now, companies are seeking advice from their lawyers about how they should treat this, as well as their accountants. And in my view, they're not being cautious enough, and there will be lawsuits. I think if a company claims to be Paris aligned whilst not taking write-downs, they could be in a position of securities fraud by not disclosing real and real material risks. I mean, you can have one set of companies doing write-downs, companies in identical activity with the same accountants not taking write-downs. So it must come down to the legal advice that they're getting. So the takeaway for everyone today is to look carefully at this, because I think in years to come, when people look at what needs to be done and the scale of the challenge, we seem to be rather leaving a lot of this to the last minute, and the quality of advice, professional advice, whether it's accounting or legal or other, is going to come under considerable scrutiny in coming years. I tweet about this at Campanelli Mark or via at Carbon Bubble, and we think it's a very topical issue, which we'd be more than delighted to come back and talk to you again in the future with a number of my other colleagues.
Thank you, Mark. That wasn't at all threatening for lawyers. Don't be negligent in your jobs. I hear you saying it also to auditors and accountants as well, that we need to, as professional advisors, think really robustly about the advice that we're giving now.
I don't know how we're doing on time. There's a very quick anecdote. We had the ex-chief auditor of one of the top 4 oil and gas companies in the world come to see us last year. And he said, we're not decommissioning our oil platforms. In fact, we're pushing decommissioning out to 2040, 2050, because we brought them in line with the Paris Agreement. It would take a huge hit to our balance sheet. So we've decided not to do that and to push out decommissioning by another 10, 20 years. Now, what kind of legal advice was he getting? This is the guy who's now retired from the chief auditor job. I wish I could tell the name of the company, but I won't. But it just tells you some of the thinking that's going on at a very senior level about the implications of what all this really means for how companies are structured.
Yeah, no, that's even at the blue chip, the top, we think that the advice is sound, but we need to interrogate all of it. Simon, could I move to you now to what's your one piece of advice? You look like you're quite pensive, so I'm expecting something big.
goodness, you set me up to
Yeah.
terrible. All right. Okay. Well, I think it comes down to this is generally a really exciting time for lawyers, and not just about the environment, because the expectation of the value which a lawyer adds to a client, or really of any shape or size, whether they're small or whether they're a global giant, isn't just what is the law. Increasingly, lawyers are being asked to be sensitive to how will this look. And the lawyer who just says, well, yes, you can do this and it complies with section such and such of the Companies Act. Yeah, this is an interesting lawyer, but a pretty boring one. What lawyers, the good lawyers are the one who say, you can do this, but you should know, based on my experience out there in the market and based on previous experience, if you do this, there's going to be a real risk that somebody is going to be coming hard for you because you haven't thought about how this would look. All you've thought about is legal compliance. So I would be saying environmental, how will this look to the planet is the question. I think it's an entirely legitimate question for people to be asking in their routine work with their clients and going even beyond contracts. It's often forgotten
Simon, we're losing a bit of your audio. Just while, yeah, that's better. Thank you. Oh no. Simon, just while you check your audio, I'm going to Silky to ask about the climate emergency declaration.
Hi, I'm actually
What do you think about law firms and climate emergency declarations?
I'm a bit skeptical, to be perfectly honest, because it's all well and good to declare all sorts of things, and that's not because I don't think that there is a huge issue with climate change, or on the contrary. But I think sort of making pretty statements will not necessarily help the issue. So I think actually what counts is, as they say in Yiddish, toch es auf den Tisch, sort of basically sort of get on with doing things, and don't write political declarations. Political declaration for me belong into policy. What we have done, however, at HSF is you may be aware that a number of companies have written to the UK Prime Minister and urged the government to build back better. So that was in connection with COVID-19, and to say basically climate and the UN principles for sustainability should not be forgotten and somehow get on the back burner. On the contrary, we need to build back better and take all of that into consideration. And that's a call to action, and that's one that we were very happy to sign. But I'm not sure whether we help the climate, even if all the law firms that are part of the Law Society of England and Wales declared a climate emergency. I'm not sure that it would help the climate or that we would have done anything else. Mm-hmm. Sort of help clients with the energy transition. I think it's much more effective.
Terrific. Thanks, Silky. And now, Simon, I'm just going to see if your audio is working. Silky's head, HSF, is responding to the call to action. The Law Society, in response to the discussion today on the climate emergency, where to from here for you at the Law Society? Can we hear you?
Yes, I've switched on my video. Can you actually make sure you hear me?
Yeah, have a go.
All right. The takeaway was not so much for the actually, it's probably a high hope for everyone listening to this excellent panel, which is when you go back to your office, whether you're in-house or out-house, or whether you're still thinking about going into a Continental, which is lovely, I think you just go back and ask your firm or whoever you're sitting with, just say, what are we doing in this firm?
Simon, it's quite difficult. We're getting a lot of it. I think we're hurting people with earphones in. Could I ask you to type when you go back to your desk, could you type that into the chat for everyone?
Yeah, will do.
Yeah, that would be fantastic. We do want to hear when you're going back to your desk. We've got 111 participants waiting to get your advice. So please type it into the chat. So we are very much focused. It's an event on law and the climate emergency. So we can't have this event not be a call to action. So today we have heard from our panelists that if we are going to have a chance of meeting the Paris Agreement targets and avoid the worst impacts of climate change, all lawyers will need to take a really proactive role. And as Simon said, it's not just environmental or climate lawyers. We all need to do that. I've heard some perhaps generous or foolhardy people say that lawyers will save the world. I'm not sure I'm going to go that far, but I'm absolutely certain that the world won't be safe without lawyers and all of us. It's our legal tools that are so key to addressing these global commons challenges like the climate emergency. We need to work with people like Mark and his experts at Carbon Tracker. Lena was talking about the climate science that she's been reading since she was 16. So we need to make sure we're connected in the world. Simon started with law firms and lawyers that we need to practice with purpose, and we need to ask ourselves as lawyers, how will this look for the planet? We need to integrate it into our day-to-day lawyering. Silky really focused on that, thinking creatively and innovatively. That was a big focus for Matt with the Chancery Lane Project. We need to learn about things like carbon bubbles. We need to think about new laws, the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty and ecocide that so many of you raised. We need to promote them, or we need to think why they aren't necessary, because there is really something to capture about that depth of feeling to talk about the criminalisation of this kind of conduct. But here is our call to action. This is not just a listening exercise. We're focused on impacts and outcomes. We hope we've inspired you to take the lead in your law practice, particularly around the Chancery Lane Project. We've got some really immediate opportunities for you to get involved. You can pledge some pro bono time, join us on Slack drafting. We've got some hackathon going on Thursday and Friday. You can take the pen during the hackathon or at any time. You can hold your own event. You can champion the existing clauses. The two new ones, that the Climate Contract Playbook Edition 2 that was just released today, the glossary also released today. And you can tell the story about why you, in whatever kind of lawyer you are, recognise the role and responsibility that you have to tackle the climate emergencies. Okay, Simon's told everyone his key question: when you get back to the office, you need to ask, how are we working with clients to help them show to the world that they have a social purpose, including saving the planet? That is direct from the President of the Law Society of England and Wales. So please take that back to your desks and ask everyone in your office. And take the opportunity to thank all of our panelists. Simon's just popped up on my screen. We've got Simon Davis, Matt Gingell, Silky Goldberg, Mark Campanale, and Lena left us earlier. She's sent her apologies. Draft back better, love it. We're having a great conversation on our chat. So we've been just engaged. We've thoroughly enjoyed this. Thank you to all the panelists, and thank you to esela, the Legal Network for Social Impact. Sarah Dobson from the Sailor Committee has been absolutely influential in bringing all of this together. So grateful to Sarah for this opportunity to discuss such an important issue for our lives, our livelihoods, and our lawyering. Thank you very much. You can join us for upcoming events. So there's the esela July Online Weekly Series that Sarah's plugging in the chat. So please join us. But for now, we'll close the proceedings.
Thank you.
Thank you.